Good evening. I'm Rachel Floor, Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. On behalf of all of my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching tonight's program online. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America, the Lowell Institute and AT&T, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe and WBUR. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. We are so grateful to have this timely opportunity to explore productive discussions across conflicts and divides with our distinguished guests this evening. And we have a fabulous panel, so I won't delay in introducing each of them. I'm so pleased to extend a warm virtual welcome to the library to Peter T. Coleman, Professor of Psychology and Education at Columbia University. Dr. Coleman directs the Morton Deutsch International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution, is the founding director of the Institute for Psychological Science and Practice, and is executive director of Columbia University's Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity. He is a renowned expert on constructive conflict resolution and sustainable peace, and his newest book, The Way Out: How to Overcome Toxic Polarization, will be released next month. I'm also delighted to welcome Archon Fung to the library virtually. Dr. Fung is the Winthrop Laughlin McCormick Professor of Citizenship and Self-Government at the Harvard Kennedy School. His research explores policies, practices, and institutional designs that deepen the quality of democratic governance. He focuses upon public participation, deliberation, and transparency. He co-directs the Transparency Policy Project and leads democratic governance programs of the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Kennedy School. He has authored 5 books, 4 edited collections, and over 50 articles appearing in professional journals. It is also a pleasure to welcome the Rev Irene Monroe to the library this evening. A theologian, syndicated columnist, and co-host of GBH's All Rev'd podcast, she is also a weekly commentator on GBH's Boston Public Radio show. Her columns appear in 23 cities across the country and in the UK and Canada, and she writes a weekly column in the Boston LGBTQ newspaper, Bay Windows. She has served as a visiting scholar in the Religion and Conflict Transformation program at Boston University School of Theology, and is the Boston voice for Detour's African American Heritage Trail. She has received numerous awards for her activism. I'm also so pleased to extend a virtual welcome to Amanda Ripley. Ms. Ripley is an investigative journalist who has spent her career trying to make sense of complicated human mysteries, from what happens to our brain in a disaster to how some countries manage to educate virtually all of their kids to think for themselves. Her first book, The Unthinkable: Who Survives When Disaster Strikes and Why, was published in 15 countries and turned into a PBS documentary. Her next book, The Smartest Kids in the World and How They Got That Way, was a New York Times bestseller. She writes for The Atlantic, Politico, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and The Wall Street Journal, among other publications. And her most recent book is High Conflict: Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out. I'm also delighted to welcome Deb Roy to the library virtually. Dr. Roy is Professor of Media Arts and Sciences at MIT, where he directs the MIT Center for Constructive Communication and is executive director of the MIT Media Labs. He leads research in applied machine learning and human-machine interaction with applications in designing systems for learning and constructive dialogue, and for mapping and analyzing large-scale media ecosystems. Deb is also co-founder and chair of Cortico, a nonprofit social technology company that develops and operates the Local Voices Network to surface underheard voices and bridge divides, and was co-founder and CEO of Bluefin Labs. He is the author of over 160 academic papers, including a study of the spread of false news that was the cover of Science magazine in 2018 and one of the most influential academic publications of that year. And finally, I'm so pleased to welcome Mo Elleithee, our moderator for this evening's discussion. He is the founding executive director of Georgetown University's Institute of Politics and Public Service. Before launching the Institute in 2015, he spent 2 decades as one of the top communications strategists in the Democratic Party, most recently as communications director and chief spokesman of the Democratic National Committee. A veteran of 4 presidential campaigns, he has also worked on numerous other statewide and local races in every region of the country. A frequent political commentary on television and radio, Mo was named a Fox News contributor in 2016. And now over to you, Mo. Thanks so much for being here.
Rachel, thank you so much for the warm welcome. And thank you to the JFK Library for putting together such an esteemed panel. We were joking in the virtual green room beforehand about how much we all miss being there in person. And so we're looking forward to maybe doing this conversation again. If we don't embarrass ourselves with this audition, getting an invitation to come do it in person. And I also just want to thank all the other panelists. I am humbled being here with such big brains, people who have thought and studied and researched this issue and covered this issue for so long. Look, I'm a reforming political hack. I spent, as I tell the students at Georgetown all the time, I'm not there to help teach them how to do politics, because people hate politics, and I'm one of the guys that helped break it by doing all the things during my 20-year career that people say they hate about politics. So I'm humbled to be here with all of you, and I'm hoping to learn a lot as we take a look at this issue. Students ask me all the time, has it always been this bad? Our politics always felt this polarized. Mm-hmm. And I say, it feels worse, but it's not like it was always sunshine and roses, right? We have always been divided. We've had one nonpartisan president in the history of the Republic, and the race to succeed him between Adams and Jefferson, they were calling each other's liars, thieves, scoundrels, and worse. We had beatings on the floor of the House of Representatives. We had a civil war where we went to armed conflict with ourselves. In the 1940s, we were interning Japanese Americans and putting them in camps. The 60s was a decade full of tumult and riots and political assassinations. So we have had very polarized times throughout our history, but it feels worse today. And I kind of want to get at that a little bit today. Why? And to help set the table just a little further, our institute has been working with a bipartisan group of pollsters over the past few years to track Americans' attitudes on the issue of civility in politics. How bad do people think it is? Who do they blame? How much do they even really want it? Our last poll, we were in the field 1 week before President Biden's inauguration. He had announced the theme of his inauguration was going to be unity, America United. So we wanted to see what he was up against as he took office. In the middle of our being in the field with the poll, the insurrection took place. So it was a really fascinating time to gauge this. We asked voters to rate the level of polarization in America on a scale of 0 to 100. 0 being no division, and 100 being brink of civil war. In the first week of January, the mean response was 76. That the average American thought we were 3/4 of the way to civil war. That's the highest it's ever rated in our poll. But there's a little bit of optimism. When we ask people to project 1 year into the future, where do they think it'll be? The mean response was 65. Not great, but certainly trending in the right direction. More than half of Americans believe, they're optimistic that President Biden can restore a sense of unity in the country. 56% say they believe he will be at least somewhat successful in restoring a sense of unity in our politics. A full 9 in 10 Americans want the president and Congress to work together to solve our most important problems. And 63% think they will be at least somewhat successful, including 44% of Republicans. Again, remember the time period, early January. But as I looked at those results and the ensuing weeks and months, I keep coming back to that whole question about unity. What the president said he wanted to do is restore a sense of American unity. And as I watched the news since then, and all the fighting, and his political opponents crying foul, saying, you are doing anything but restoring unity. You ask them why, what does the word unity mean? Whether you ask them or whether you ask people in the White House, and you get all sorts of different answers. So it occurs to me that's a good place to start. And I'm just going to throw this question open to the group. Anyone can jump in. What does unity mean in American political society? I can start calling on you, or okay, Irene, go ahead.
Okay, so it's interesting. I don't necessarily use the word unity, but this is what I think here. I think that if we're going to use that term unity, that we are crawling more towards a multicultural democracy and a participatory government. So how do I see this moment? So it's very interesting because you were asking the question, it feels worse than certainly the historical events that you certainly laid out. But to me, and I think that's where social location and positionality and multiple identities and all that plays into it. But when I look at this moment, and I need to just say this, I'm not the most hopeful person, but I feel hopeful because I think we're in a third Reconstruction period. The first one being clearly after the Civil War, and we get what we call the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th. I'm a beneficiary of what I call the Second Civil War, which is the civil rights movement of the 16. We get the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act, and we can even go to Mildred versus Loving, 1965. We're in this moment, which I call a third Reconstruction, because when I look at the panel, the mere fact that it is diverse, we are now voices that clearly back when I look at the first and second Reconstruction, we didn't have that. So I'm optimistic in that as we enfranchise more and more people, we're becoming what we ideally have written on the page. So I'm hoping that a couple of, this is how I feel as a pastor. I may not be able to change the hearts of people, okay, but the laws will change the behavior. So as an LGBT, as a lesbian, I can get married not only in, the People's Republic of Cambridge where I reside, but down in the Mississippi Delta. So I'm hoping that as we move forward, we will pass more laws that reflect marginalized people.
Irene, I got to hang out with you more. I need more optimistic people and hopeful people in my life. All right. Anyone else want to weigh in on what unity in American politics means?
I just want to point out that, sorry.
No, go ahead, Amanda.
If I could go back to what the Reverend Monroe said in the very beginning, she said, I don't really use that word unity. And I wonder, could we get like a show of hands for which of the panelists use that word unity on the regular as a goal? None of us.
Yeah.
So why not? Why not? Right? We're talking about it every day. Yeah. The White House is talking about it. Why don't we, or why shouldn't we?
Well, I'll go and then I'll open it. I want to hear everybody. I think that's so interesting, right? Here are people who all look at divides in different ways, and none of us use the word unity. So for me, I spent the past 4 years following people who were stuck in really difficult conflicts, personal, political. And one of them was a conflict expert named Gary Friedman, who's helped probably 2,000 people through really hard conflicts as a conflict mediator. And one of the leading experts on conflict mediation. And he doesn't use the word compromise either in his office. So this is in labor strikes, ugly custody battles, like all kinds of human misery. Doesn't like the word compromise because it feels like a surrender. And in his experience, if you give up the thing you hold most dear, it will come back to haunt you. So the whole, like most of what he spends his time doing is trying to help people figure out what that is, right? So if I think about my relationship with my husband, unity's nice, but it's not my main goal. You know what I mean? So you think about it, like, because sometimes he's wrong and sometimes I'm wrong. So unity is like a phase you want to be in sometimes, but it's not like the goal. So for me, the goal is good conflict. The goal is where we can be in, heated disagreement and still be curious and have dignity and treat each other with humanity. So that's slightly different, but maybe I'm getting hung up on the wordsmithing. What do you all?
No, but I think it's important, right? I think what you're talking about is important. And, the title of this conversation is polarization, which I wanted to start with taking Irene's cue here, start with the hopeful, optimistic ideal, right? But then get into the bigger issue. When you talk about good conflict, Peter, I want to turn to you because you've got a book out about toxic polarization. Not all, to Amanda's point, not all disagreement is bad, right? Not all conflict is bad. There's a good conflict and there's a bad conflict. Talk a little bit about that.
Can I quickly weigh in on unity? Because
yes, please.
I have to say I'm pro-unity because, again, it depends on what we're talking about. But if we're talking about the United States of America right now, creating unity out of diversity is the ideal. Right? It is what Aristotle saw as the ideal, that we come together as a diverse people, we negotiate our interests, and we somehow achieve unity. So unity doesn't mean that we, collapse and give in and allow white supremacists to take over. Unity is coming together enough that we can shape our destiny together and move forward. And so that I support as an ideal. And it's a really hard thing to do under conditions of what I call toxic polarization. So to answer your question, polarization is a natural thing that happens in science. It's when you've seen magnetic poles and filaments that are either attracted to or repelled by these two different poles, and that's kind of a natural phenomenon in science. And in politics, polarization to some degree is necessary and healthy. It helps as a check and balance, right? So that we have certain people that believe in tradition and stability and order, and others that champion change and reform. And to some degree, we need both, right? Every society needs some sense of stability and coherence and needs to keep learning and changing and growing and becoming more inclusive. So polarization is when those things start to split off, become autistic and not speak to each other, and develop a sense of, toxicity is poison. So that's the problem today, is that we are in the context of, to this date, and as you said, historically, the US has had other major challenges. But this current trajectory of polarization started in the late 60s, I suspect, and we have evidence of this and bottom-up evidence of communities and attitudes, as well as top-down evidence looking at what's happening in DC. And it gets to a point where we get sick, we start to develop stress and anxiety and alienation from one another in our relationships, in our families, in our communities, and it scales. And our society gets sick. And we see this on so many dimensions, right? We see it in terms of affective polarization, loving our group and despising, feeling contempt for the other groups. We see it in what we call ideological consistency, which means that the Pew Research Center tracks 10 different issues over time. And they look at the degree to which people have different opinions on different issues. Well, our understanding of those issues is collapsing within tribes, which means we're not paying attention to really complicated issues. We're just following our tribe's point of view. So intellectually, cognitively, emotionally, and probably more important, physically and structurally, we're sorting, right? You see sorting in rural-urban differences. And the Times had a piece 2 weeks ago about sorting within cities. You look in urban areas, you see neighborhoods and pockets that are red or blue, and we're clustering. So we're physically moving away from each other. And again, when that becomes toxic is when it starts to make us sick, our family sick, and our society less capable of tackling major problems that we have to come together on, right? Inequality, increasing exponential inequality, climate change, racism, and police violence against Black and brown bodies. These are epidemics that we're facing as a nation, and yet we can't come together sufficiently to address them.
So I'm going to jump around a bit, looking at both some of the root causes and challenges we face, but also try to weave in some positive examples. This is not one of those times. Archon, let me turn to you, because I'm very curious, as a lifelong partisan, and I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with being partisan, right? Like waking up every morning, believing in a worldview and fighting for that worldview. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. But we have a two-party system, and that two-party system has served us well-ish throughout the course of the Republic. But today, given some of the sorting that Peter's talking about and some of the other structural challenges we face, can we get past toxic polarization within our current two-party system?
I don't know. And it does go, I think, to the unity issue. When President Biden and candidate Biden said unity, I think, people were reading what they wanted to into that word. It's a big, big word. And I think one kind of unity is really important, and another kind of unity I don't expect, right? In a marriage, in a football game, in a soccer match, it is about contestation a little bit. And, people have different perspectives and have different goals, and that's good, right? And democracy is like that, right? It thrives because people want different things and have different ideas about how to move forward. But what makes a marriage work, what makes a football game work, what makes a soccer match work is that there's some underlying agreement about how we work out those differences and what the rules of the game and the road are, right? If I'm in a marriage and we like to watch movies, one way to do it is to alternate. Like this Saturday, we'll watch something I'm more into. Maybe next Saturday, we'll watch something you're more into. But once I start insisting that every Saturday it's my movie, things start falling apart. A football game, right? People are trying really hard to beat one another. But if one side thinks, oh, face masking rule, that's a stupid rule, I'm going to start yanking on that guy's helmet, right? Then things start falling apart. And part of what's going on right now that is very terrifying is disagreement about what the rules of the game should be. And, going back to Irene's second reconstruction, I think that the fight over who gets to vote and who gets to participate in the United States has not been this intense since the civil rights movement. And you see this in Georgia, Florida, Texas, many, many other places. And that's a really terrifying threat to unity. We should be unified on the idea that every American gets an equal voice in the political system, at least at the ballot box. And 100% of people participating is a little bit better than 90%, which is a little bit better than 80%, which is a little bit better than 70%. And when we start disagreeing about that, when I start thinking, well, 50% is better participating than 90% as long as it's my 50%, then that's going to be a problem. That's like when one side thinks, like face masking. Yeah, let's start doing that, right? And so I think that's the kind of that disunity, disagreement over what the rules of democracy are and what the rules of the road that we're seeing in a lot of places. I think that's a real problem. And I think it's in your historical span, not new, right? We've seen it in different decades, but I think in the last 40 years or so, it's kind of peaking in a way. And then and that's related, right, to the two-party issue, right? Right now, like if you look back in the 1970s, 90% of Congress was in between the leftmost Republican and the rightmost Democrat in Congress, like 80 or 90%. All of Congress is purple, basically. If you count purple, that's what purple is. Now it's zero. Nobody is between the leftmost Republican and the rightmost Democrat, right? And so the parties are kind of perfectly sorted. That's like an indication of congressional polarization. And it kind of goes into the rules of the game issue. It's like, I don't think it's just how we're treating each other and how we feel about each other. We really disagree a lot more than we did about what and where America should go and what good public policy is, right? Mo, I don't know how long you've been involved in politics, but like compared to right now, I think the difference between either Clinton and either Bush is minuscule compared to the difference between, forget about Bernie and Trump, like Joe Biden and Donald Trump, right? The distance is wide. And I think you were there, but imagine in the first or second term of the Obama administration, you'd walked into the West Wing and said, hey, you guys, what do you think about a universal basic income or Medicare for all? Or how about a wealth tax, right? People, I think around that room would have kind of snickered at you. And then they would have, you go on for about 10 minutes, they would have yanked your West Wing pass and escorted you out, because back in those days, polite policy debate was a much narrower range. And if the Republicans and Democrats don't disagree about very much, there's not that much to be polarized about, at least in the issue space, right? But now the issue space is really like, some people want to build a wall and other people want a wealth tax. And there's a huge, huge difference between that. And we don't have the muscles, unlike a lot of societies, we don't have the muscles to deal with that intense level of disagreement, because basically since 1970 until the end of the Obama era, I think the policy disagreement was within a very, very narrow range. And now it's it's really, really wide. And I just want to, I'll end by, you asked about the two-party system. I think it's really hard for two parties to deal with this level of disagreement, because they just, especially our two parties, they just keep spinning out and out and out into a tribalism and into more intensely polarized policy positions. And I'm just going to show you this chart from a great book by Lee Drutman called The Two-Party Doom Loop. And this is a figure that shows a bunch of different countries that are democratic countries and how many parties they have, effective parties they have. And as you'll see, right, the US is a way, way, way outlier in terms of just having two parties. Almost everybody has like 2.5. Some people have way more parties than that. And so I do think the state of our republic is in a sufficiently divided such that we should consider big structural reforms, like more than two parties, that would allow us to work out our disagreements, I think, in a more in a more reasonable way.
It's interesting hearing you talk about sort of the differences between them. For most of my life, and probably for a couple of generations above me, the dominant fissure in our political dialogue was over the size of government, right? With the right believing that there should be the most limited form of government is necessary, and the left arguing, no, there can be a more expanded role for government in helping everyday people. That left versus right paradigm. Now, I've been arguing, and you may or may not agree, but I've been arguing that in outside of the Beltway, that paradigm has shifted, right? The left versus right paradigm isn't what's real anymore. That's a front versus back paradigm that most people operate on. It's between the people at the front of the line and the people who feel stuck at the back of the line. Mm. And the challenge, I think, is that almost everybody believes that they are stuck at the back of the line and the people at the front of the line are holding them back. Whether you're talking about, a Black voter in the inner city or a rural white voter, they believe that the system is rigged against them. And it's become a sense of identity for many people. And so, Irene, you talk about this a lot, you write about this a lot, sort of the impact. I'm curious what you think the impact of identity and lived experience or historical experience for various communities adds to this sense of polarization.
All right, thank you. I want to say a couple of things here. I totally agree we need more than two parties. It would make our household a little easier to live in here and stuff. I do feel that there are a couple of things that I see it as. We got to sort of address the elephant in the room, which is race and class. So it's very, very interesting because, we say that race is America's original sin, but class is hidden. And the reason why I say that, particularly given when you say white rural and Black urban, we tend to pit these two groups together. And a classic example of this was the Boston busing crisis. And the reason why I want to bring that particular incident up is that you had Southie versus Roxbury. And the truth is that neither students need to go to Roxbury High or Southie High, because they both need a leg up and a foot out of their situation. So one of the things that we got to understand that complicates race and why urban Blacks and rural whites is because there's an intentionality by the dominant white culture to keep that group constantly feuding with each other. But we got to talk about race in this instance too, because we're talking about unity, and that, if you pastor a church, you never get unity. You settle with the movable middle, okay, and the gradualists. But what I've seen here, when we see a sharp demarcation in terms of polarization, I saw it with Obama. And the interesting thing that I've come to understand with that is that as we see more brown and Black ascendancy, you will always see a Whitelash. So, and you see it differently in this incident. So the interesting thing is that when Obama was running, we saw the Tea Party, we saw the birther movement. We don't see that now. So there's a level of a comfortability about, we may not like Biden, but he's supposed to be there. So I think that one of the things that we really have to do, and I say this from a pastoral point of view, from an activist, is that, yes, we have to address racism, but we got to do it in a multi-pronged approach. You can't heal the world and the social ills if you don't heal the racism and the homophobia, and the transphobia that you carry in yourself, because they will show up in these institutions. So I think it's wonderful to say that we're going to create equity, we're going to do this, because it's very, very interesting. Like when I'm thinking about face recognition, we kind of say, well, that should be very unbiased, but you got to think of who's the person that's feeding that information in. So it has to be a kind of two-pronged, but I just need to say this. While we will definitely need to talk about race, we also need to talk about class.
I think that's a great point. I want to move to, because so often these conversations seem so intractable, right? And based on my experience, the worse it gets, the more local the conversation, the more provincial the conversation, the more heated it can be. They can oftentimes be some of the most polarizing conversations. But there are examples of people being able to get it done. Amanda, you write in your new book, you tell a story about wolves in Denmark and how it created some really passionate rifts within the community, but they were able to get past those rifts. I'm wondering if you could just give a brief overview of what happened and what we can learn from that experience.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's helpful to come at the thing sideways. So when it's your country that's really divided, it feels really unique and intractable and overwhelming, at least to me. But when you look at, you take little micro examples from other places, it's not the same, but it can kind of expand our collective imagination. So I'll just tell a very quick story, and you can take it or leave it. But for 200 years, no wolves had been seen in Denmark. And then in 2012, some bird watchers spotted a wolf trotting along the countryside, having crossed over from Germany. And soon a female appeared, and then 5 years later, 7 wolf puppies appeared, which now qualified as a pack. And very quickly, people, as they do, started arguing about the wolves. The farmers resented the wolves for attacking their livestock. Environmentalists defended the wolves, didn't want anyone to harm them. And in a lot of places, that conflict was really healthy. It was a good conflict. Questions got asked, But as often happens these days, the wolf conflict started to escalate in some places and took on a life of its own. And it became an us versus them conflict, and that complexity sort of collapsed. Conspiracy theories sprang up. In Denmark, people said that a van had crossed over from Germany and intentionally released the wolves. And in France, 50 angry farmers kidnapped the head of a national park in the Alps, demanding that the wolves there be killed. And just things got crazy, right? And then in 2018, two naturalists were filming Denmark's only female wolf when a man drove by and shot and killed the animal out of his window, which was caught on video, which became a viral, outrage-inducing clip. And actual differences of opinion about the wolves, which were real, sort of became less important than the conflict itself, right? Which is where conflict can get really unhealthy. So in this one little town, there were a couple of social scientists who invited everyone to a meeting and tried going into the conflict. So not avoiding it, not just, screaming at each other on social media, but going into the conflict to get underneath it. Most conflicts at that level, there's the thing we talk about endlessly, and then the thing it's really about, and trying to get to what that is, right? So they had everybody come together, and there was a lot of anxiety and frustration, and people weren't sure what they were doing there. And one of the things they did was just get it all out. Like, what are you worried about with the wolves? And everybody, there was a broad range of opinion, even though it had been portrayed in the media as like an urban-rural conflict. There was a lot of different opinions, even within this rural community, which was where the wolf pack was located. And then it was like, okay, and they wrote down everybody's complaint because, so like one of the things I've learned is that at least half of what people need is to be heard. That's not enough, right? But it's amazing how rarely it happens. And people do not feel like they are heard most of the time. And there's a ton of really cool research on this, but I'll skip it and just keep with the story. So what they were doing was hearing people about the wolves. And then after they got all of that out, they asked people to imagine any future scenario that would be better. The crazier, the better. So they're trying now to widen the lens on the conflict, right? And, at first the ideas were sort of small, but then they just got really creative. Like people said, what if we built a zip line that went right into where the wolves are and it could become a tourist attraction, revive the local economy? And what if we had an app where only the locals had the app, but it showed, we put chips in all the wolves so we could see where they were. And my personal favorite was, what if we could make the wolves vegetarian? Problem solved, So this went on, and they ended up doing this for over a year, having these meetings. It was hard. Like sometimes when you hear about these conversations, it sounds very like kumbaya, and it's not. Like it is like an Ironman competition level of hard, and there have to be sort of ground rules to make it work. And they always started every meeting with dinner, which is important. And but the point is, by the end of it, they were presenting to the community about their ideas. They brought in national officials who use those ideas in the wolf management plan that Denmark's working on. And it's not like the problem got solved, but it shifted from high conflict to good conflict. So that's one little shoebox diorama of a conflict that seemed intractable and was not, at least in this place.
What I love about that is everyone came together. And there was a baseline conversation where you talked about facts, and then where they talked about facts, and then everyone was heard, right? Deb, I want to bring you into the conversation, because I think one of the things that makes this moment more polarized than normal, or than past periods in American history, is this is the first social media era, right? And the Wall Street Journal ran this fantastic graphic, I'm sure many of you saw, right before the 2016 election. That they called red feed, blue feed, where they entered the same keywords into a conservative's Facebook search engine and a progressive's Facebook search engine, and saw what results came up. And it was as if they were living in two completely different universes. To Peter's point earlier about how we're sorting ourselves, are algorithms further sorting us? Are algorithms further polarizing us in our discourse?
Thanks, Mo. Actually, this whole time I've also been thinking about unity. So let me, and then tie it in.
Yeah, please.
Media. I do feel like just kind of hearing everyone's views on this, that the optimist in me feels like there's a moment where more diversity than ever may flourish in the coming years and decades in this country. And with that, the concept of unity feels like, for me personally, the less relevant word, and this kind of growing need for a live and let live kind of philosophy where, and I really appreciate Archon's analogy to the football match and the shared rules, which maybe when we use the word unity, at least for me, the connotation of unity is something more than just we agree to the rules. There's something about shared values. And the more you have true diversity and these different groups that are able to find their voice, I think the idea that there is deep shared values amongst the groups, as opposed to more of a need for a somewhat decoupled, decentralized live and let live kind of approach, where the word unity doesn't fit for me in the same way. So there's something so important about the underlying rules of engagement, and if those come undone, then everything comes undone. So certainly unity applies at that level, but it's kind of abstract and it's sort of distant from most of our everyday lives and experiences. That's why, for me, the word doesn't come up often in sort of my day-to-day. So I just wanted to loop back to the beginning there. So social media, you ask about algorithms. I think algorithms, yes, they matter. They're playing a role. I think it's complicated, what exactly the role, because the algorithms themselves are complicated and keep shifting, but we are roughly one human generation into the World Wide Web and the social media platforms that have arisen on top, which have such a dominant influence, I think, on how we understand one another. And one of the properties of most, I don't think all, but most of the social platforms, they are designed to really just leverage the speed and scale of the internet. And there's a kind of natural bias towards inviting everyone to be a broadcaster. And it's a kind of a social broadcast network, or these different networks. And most of us don't want to be broadcasters. Most of us have learned social skills for how to express ourselves in non-digital environments when you grow up as kids. And when those violations are broken, you tend to retract and not express your whole, you don't bring your whole self. I think on top of that, if you look at the incentives of the platforms, fundamentally it's to keep people on the platforms. These are ad-supported platforms. And so if you go back to the early days, we used to call them social networks. And today we call them social media. So what happened to these platforms? The idea that this is a network where you connect with others, maybe people you know, or you want to follow. But if those people and those sources that you connect with don't provide enough content to keep you engaged, the companies, the platforms had a challenge. They had to find more ways to keep you engaged and keep you on the platform. And so fast forward to today, and you find a general pattern, which is the content that tends to keep people engaged most predictably is the most provocative content, the most emotional content. So that's bad news for truth, because false news tends to be more provocative and lead to more emotion. And in the moment, your kind of fast responses of what to share or what to react to are those most emotional pieces of content. And finally, just to connect it to this idea of there being very different groups, if our primary way to understand one another is through these platforms, which are promoting the most extreme and really the loudest voices, that are often reactive. They're not really connected to what's happening in everyday life. This idea, as Amanda emphasized, the importance for us to be heard. Most of us are not being heard on these platforms. That's the great paradox. If you go back and talk to the founders of all of these platforms and the creator of the World Wide Web, Sir Tim Berners-Lee and so forth, and ask, what was your assumptions going in? And you'll hear over and over, well, as we make it easier to connect and take more and more friction out, people will become more connected. So the idea that we've actually created in some ways the ultimate self-sorting machine, where we can tune into people we want to hear from and those we don't. And the algorithms just pick up on those signals and reinforce this kind of self-sorting. And when we are exposed to others, if we hear these provocative extreme perspectives, it can actually, I think, accelerate the sort of othering and grow a sense of caricature. I don't think all the platforms have these properties. It's interesting, people forget LinkedIn is a social platform with hundreds of millions of users. And so it's kind of interesting to look at what it is about certain platforms that have these properties and how we can look at where things are effective and think about creating new possibilities.
Mo, can I jump in just as
Please.
a little bit of a counterpoint? I mean, I mostly agree. I guess I'm optimistic in the 5 to 10 year frame about social media. I think it's still kind of early days, and I'm hopeful that it'll get to a better place. And Deb, what you say is certainly right, that, most of us, that there's relatively few voices compared to everybody on social media that are getting heard. But the good part about it is, or maybe a half good part, is it's a whole lot more voices than were getting heard in the era of mass media, right? So the voices that are getting heard in the era of mass media are responsible politicians and officials, but mostly journalists who are trained in the same elite institutions and share the same values. And so, it was kind of for a while hard to get a word in edgewise if you were the civil rights movement or you didn't like the Vietnam War, right? And so without social media, I think, the Tea Party would have had a lot harder time getting off the ground, but so would the movement for Black Lives, and so would Me Too. And so it does introduce, I think, in addition to exacerbating the toxicity, it does get some voices that would have been iced out of for several decades, a very narrow, fairly homogenous sense of what counts as good news and information.
Totally agree, Archon. Thanks for, I went into Mo's question around some of the problems caused by algorithms, but I should have said up front that new voices have, and actually some of my optimism for the kind of diversity flourishing, I actually credit the social platforms, and they continue to do that. So it is such a complicated mix of newness. Yeah,
you're right. It is complicated, right? I mean, and on one hand, the Arab Spring, Black Lives Matter, right? Major social movements are now taking off, and new voices are being elevated, but they're also being isolated, right? I mean, we're going into these pockets. We're being sorted again, and if the algorithms are only, my feed is full of a lot of pro Black Lives Matter, right? Whereas my neighbor down the street may be getting a lot of, anti, and we're just coming at it differently. And I think your point, Deb, about sort of the model, right? Like they had the companies had to find a way to keep people engaged. It's not limited just in the digital era. Traditional media also has this as it has exploded, and you get more and more cable news networks and more digital publications. As they mentioned in my bio, I'm a Democratic contributor at Fox News. I don't go online. I don't go on Fox to try to win an argument. I go on Fox because I want people to kind of pause and say, he's not what I thought he was. He's not the caricature that others paint him to be, right? And I'll occasionally get some feedback to that effect. But I also get an equal amount of feedback, particularly my Twitter feed, from people who say, I don't know why Fox hires you. You should go to CNN or MSNBC, where you belong. And it's that last phrase, the where you belong part, that always gets me. right? I don't need your perspective polluting my mind. I don't need your perspective cluttering my ears. You go where your voice is welcome and leave us here, right? And I have Republican friends who go on MSNBC and they get the same thing over there. And you know, Amanda, you've written about sort of the role of journalism and what journalists can do. The business, you know, what do you do when the business model rewards this polarization? But journalism is a form of public service. How do you reconcile those? What can journalists do better to address this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge and growing disconnect between what the public wants from journalism and what journalists think they should deliver to the public. So I don't think that newsroom conventions have caught up to the reality that we don't control the microphone anymore. I mean, we know that, right, rationally, but what we need to do to be of service has changed. And one obstacle to it evolving is the business model, which you've mentioned, right? The attention economy that plagues Twitter is the same thing that plagues the places I write for and Fox News and other places. But I actually think almost as big a problem and hurdle are the sort of legacy conventions and traditions of many newsrooms. It is very hard to give up control in any industry, right? But part of what I think we have to do, I'm curious what you all think, is shrink the distance between our institutions and the people, because we have a crisis of distrust. It's not even about, do I trust the media? No. It's active distrust, right? So we will continue to live in alternate realities that will not intersect until we work on this trust problem. So that's a hard problem, right? I'm very interested in finding solutions if you have any, but one of them I think is to shrink that distance, to really listen aggressively to our audiences. How can we be of service? What do you want to know that you don't already know? What are you curious about? What do you wish the other side knew about you? What do you want to know about the other side? Like, those are fundamentally different questions. And there are companies doing this, like Archon is one that works in 15 countries, 100 newsrooms all over the world, you know, creating the systems that help newsrooms listen to the public. But the only other thing I wanted to say about that is, you know, we sort of keep coming back to this theme of the need for rules of engagement. And that's something we don't have on social media. And I will say that while it's great to have all these voices, you know, when I was a staff writer at Time Magazine for 10 years, there were a bunch of stories that we worked really hard on and didn't publish because of the fear of lawsuits and liability. And Twitter and Facebook are protected from that, right? And YouTube, like, that's nonsense. Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. And if you know, feel free to argue with me if you think I'm wrong, but that fear of lawsuits wasn't always great, but it often did prevent us from going with a story before it was really ready, before we had done the work to make sure we heard from everyone and turned over every stone. And if we didn't have that, I promise you, we would have run those stories, like 100%. So there has to be some regulations and some guardrails to help. Because we're right now, like social media, some of these platforms, it's like, you know, cigarettes in the 1951, like we don't have any guardrails. So it's just, you know, that's a fixable problem. And so that, to me, this idea of having referees, having rules of engagement seems really important. And it is often with violent conflict, how you shift from high conflict to good conflict. So I think that's a great theme to keep coming back to.
I want to say something about that. May I?
Yeah, please.
Please. Social media, and I so agree with you, Amanda, that it definitely needs a rule of engagement and guardrails. But it really, in many ways, democratized voices. It has really pointed to subjugated voices and stories that don't normally, you know, hit the news, and particularly with certain demographic groups. So, for instance, like, and this is long before social media, you know, when I grew up, we were not reading the New York Times. And I'm from New York. We were reading the Amsterdam News because it spoke to our particularity. It's one of the reasons why we got the LGBT, you know, papers that we had. So, but what now I see with main media, and particularly, like, I'll say the Boston Globe, you know, where we couldn't get a story about a Black trans or a trans woman of color being killed. And we can get it in the Boston Globe. And unfortunately, one was killed over this weekend. Well, you would have to wait until one of the, you know, LGBTQ papers came out, or a Black paper came out that said, listen, someone in our community, these are the things we need to do. So social media has really, in many ways, created what I could best call, and I always say this, if you listen to me on Monday mornings, it provides a kind of intersectional engagement and activism, as well as news reporting, that it's just not in the hands of a few who makes the decision of what news should be and look like.
Yeah,
I think that's such an important point, that that social media does give everyone that voice, but can we make the system work better so that more people are hearing those voices, right? And it's not limited to just those who constantly click like. Mainstream media might be seen as more legitimate if there were more diverse voices as editors, as reporters, who were making the story selections and not just relegating certain things to the Amsterdam News, right? I'm sorry, Deb, you were about to say something.
Sorry, I forgot the point. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I wanted to chime in on Amanda's.
Archon,
Sorry. Go ahead.
And real quick, he just put his hand up, and then we'll come to you. Peter, go ahead.
Well, I was just I agree with what has been said, but I think it's important to separate the technology of social media, which I think is a democratization process and has opened up all kinds of channels for for dissent, for feedback, for activism and organization. And I think that's critical. I think we have to separate that from the business model that Amanda and others have talked about. I'll tell a quick story. About 2 years ago, I was invited to a pop-up meeting in Midtown Manhattan by an organizer of a kind of community activist group. And it was a meeting on polarization on the internet. And I walked in at noon one day, and there were major players. One of the founders of Facebook was there, an executive from Facebook, Jigsaw, Google, they were all there. It was kind of an interesting thing. There was about a dozen of us. And they wrote up on the whiteboard, what kind of dialogue should we be having on a virtual dialogue in order to create a healthy society? And so I said, well, what do you mean by dialogue? Because usually when we say dialogue, we mean debate, which is more of a kind of competitive game. And dialogue in my world is not about debate and winning an argument. It is about openness and discovery and learning about myself and the other and the issues and the complexity inherent in all of that. And so then there was silence in the room, and the founder of Facebook, not him, but somebody else, said, oh, well, if that's dialogue, then there's no place on the internet, there's no major platform on the internet that allows that. That the internet is all about competition, social comparison, contention, controversy. That's the currency of the major platforms on the internet. And he said, Zoom is one space where you can have dialogue and learn and open up. But the business model is to tap into our lesser selves, our more competitive tribal selves, which is low-hanging fruit. And what research is showing us is it's addictive. Outrage is addictive in similar ways to heroin. They see in the brain that when you're outraged, it lights up your pleasure centers in your brain, right? And these business executives know this. They understand this. Their job is to make these platforms as addictive as possible, like iPhones, right? Like when your thing goes off on your iPhone, it's like, oh, you get a little jolt, right? So the business model underlying these things is the problem, because it's been so successful that you understand how they refuse to change it. And so even when it's weaponized in Myanmar and South Sudan, when they are weaponizing these technologies to actually commit genocide on people, it's hard for them to pull back too far. And that is out of control. There's so much money. Facebook has so much money that they can tolerate billion-dollar lawsuits at this point, you know. So this is a runaway train, and that's part of the problem of the business model. The social media is still a very young society. We don't have the norms and guardrails. The government has to figure out how to move in and demand that, or the public has to rise up and demand that. And I understand the possible consequences of excluding voices. I think we have to be very careful of that because the technology allows that. But the business model is acutely problematic.
And I think just to add to that, back to Mo, your question about journalism as a public service, but most of journalism is, of course, a for-profit enterprise, and exactly the same analysis applies to the media industry, including most of what we call journalism is embedded in this business model. And so much of the content flowing through the social networks are being fed by a relatively small number of sources that are often the media businesses. So it is the same analysis runs all the way through the system.
So
Can I
we're
jump
going
in
to
on-
start.
Oh,
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Archon.
just on Amanda's point in journalism, Amanda, I think your point about the institutions moving closer to the people they serve is so important. To problematize that, I believe that part of the polarization that we're experiencing is a polarization of institutions as well, with mainstream journalism, mainstream media and journalism, and selective higher ed especially cleaving left, and the military, and Reverend Monroe, you're not in this, but much of religion cleaving to the right. And this, of course, is how people vote. Large majorities of participants in those institutions themselves are polarized. And then to the journalism point, there is an analogy, right? The last big technological shift was the rise of radio and television in the pre-war era. And a lot of people thought that those forms of media were instrumental to the rise of fascism in Germany, in Italy, in Japan. And after World War II, there was a reckoning. A lot of people in Europe and a lot of people in the United States says, how can we make media safe for democracy rather than the handmaiden of fascism, right? And in America, people like Henry Luce, founder of Time Magazine, and other media people participated in a kind of corporate social responsibility to make media safe for democracy. They took a big hit to the bottom line, and they evolved norms like, well, we have to have journalists, and we have to pay people like Amanda enough so that it's a profession, and that costs money. And people like Amanda should try to get both sides of the story and to try to get to the truth. And if Amanda writes a piece that exposes the wrongdoing of our biggest advertiser, we know we should probably run Amanda's story, because there needs to be a separation between the business part and the reporting part. And these are norms and rules of the road that aren't automatic. We had to create them self-consciously as a society because we wanted media to inform citizens to be able to do their job in a democracy. It was a big, muscular, hard lift. And what I want to know is, where are the people trying to do that same lift for social media right now? Because that's what we need.
I'm going to start to weave in questions that are coming in from the audience and commingle them with a few of mine as well. And this first one I find very interesting. I can't see it, but I understand the chat on YouTube is very lively right now. And so that's the context. And the question, it says, asks, the irony tonight is fairly significant in my mind. On one side of my screen, the panelists are discussing pathways to unity and solutions. Meanwhile, the chat feed exemplifies the reality of polarization at the grassroots level. As our moderator confessed in the beginning of the broadcast, both sides of the political aisle have targeted this division because it's proven an effective means for fundraising and winning primaries. How do we change this broken system when the very ones we elect are in many ways the very catalyst of the issue? Now, I want to add to that a secondary question. as a longtime political practitioner, I oftentimes wonder how much of this is coming from the leaders that the questioner is talking about versus the people themselves. And I go back to the poll that we did, trying to understand how much people really want to break through this polarization. We asked them, do you want more stability in politics? And like 93% say yes, right? Although I'm very curious who that 7% are. But then we ask them a question a little bit differently. Agree or disagree with the following statements. First one, common ground and compromise are noble goals we want our leaders to aspire to. 87% of voters say yes, they agree with that common ground and compromise are a noble goal. Very next question, agree or disagree. I am tired of leaders who compromise on my values. I want them to stand up and fight the other side. Right? It's as if they are saying in many cases, oh, I totally want common ground. Just come stand where I am and then we'll be on common ground. Right? That's a tough line for an elected leader to walk. Should I compromise? Should I find common ground? Or am I supposed to fight the other side? And so I think about that in the context of this audience member's question, like what's the incentive structure? Right? Is the incentive structure for less polarization? Is it for more polarization? When you see people like Marjorie Taylor Greene getting rewarded by grassroots donors to the tune of $3 million for putting out conspiracy theories, and people who do compromise getting punished in their party primaries, what is the incentive structure? I'll toss this one out to the group.
So I'll quickly respond. I think the incentive structure for many of us has to be to take a good look at our life right now and take a good look at our own levels of anxiety and stress, at the tension that we feel in our neighborhoods, when we go out, when we watch the news, the addictive nature of outrage, right? That we get drawn into watching and following things that maybe we don't need to. I think the toxicity in our life and when that scales up, the inability, how it impairs our decision makers to be able to do good work against really difficult problems is what we have to unite to fight against. I've been informally consulting to the Biden administration for several months. I know that Biden was all about sort of healing. And what we know from the study of post-conflict societies where you've had open violent war is that you don't go in early and say, let's heal, let's reconcile. You don't use that term because people are angry and they're ready for a fight. And I get that. I understand that. I feel the same thing, right? So it's premature to say it's time to reconcile and heal. But what people will understand is that this is making us sick. It's making our society sick, our community sick, and our family sick, and it's not good for us. And we have to find a way to turn the temperature down and to at least tolerate, and begin to start to hear not the extremes, right? Somebody told me recently that 80% of Twitter is the content of Twitter, 80% of it comes from 2% of the participants. So you've got these extremes that are filling us with this vitriol, right? It is time for the middle that's exhausted and fed up to mobilize ourselves and kind of take back the discourse and take back how we communicate to each other and how we work with each other. And the common enemy here is the toxicity in our lives, in our families and communities. That's what we have to kind of learn to fight together.
I've been trying to find, like my analogy, one analogy is to the Cold War. And the reason is mutually assured destruction, right? I mean, during both sides had lots of incentives to build more and more warheads, but at some point everyone dies. And so let me put a challenge out there to the panel and to the audience. So what do? It's a mutual de-escalation. You can't unilaterally disarm because then you'll get crushed by the other side, right? So What does that look like? Like, would you have taken this deal, Mo, would you have taken this deal in January? Is, okay, you're a Democrat. The deal is don't impeach President Trump if the Republicans support the major pieces of HR1. And HR1 is a big piece of voting legislation that would dramatically enable lots and lots of people to vote. So I think of that as that's kind of my fantasy, is leaders saying, okay, we're going to try to turn the temperature down by de-escalating a little bit. And most of my friends who are capital D Democrats that I've talked to say, no way I'd take that deal, right? It's just a fantasy. But it's like, how do we think of ways to ratchet down just a little bit at a time?
Can I give?
But look at Liz Cheney, right? Liz Cheney, who is, you don't find many more conservative members in Congress than Liz Cheney. She kind of took the converse of that deal, right? She said, look, we lost, right? And there was no fraud. And she's about to get booted. Now, you can argue that that's a DC thing, right? But if you look across the country, grassroots Republicans are punishing Republicans who stood up. And so again, it comes back to this question, like, where's the incentive? Where's the incentive for more Liz Cheneys if they're just going to get booted out? And whatever the equivalent is on the other side. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Peter.
Well, I just want to say, just a quick response. So during the Cold War, a man named Charles Osgood put forth a theory called grit theory, which is about gradual reciprocation and tension reduction. And what he said is, what happens when you're in a Cold War and an arms race is you start to become crazy and psychotic, and you become delusional about the other side and our side. And that's where we are. And that when you're delusional, that's the toxicity. And what you can do is unilaterally create a strategy to de-escalate. So it's not tinkering and just trying to de-escalate a little bit here and there. It's saying, this is unhealthy for us as a society. This is what we're going to do. We are going to systematically bring things down. We invite the other side to join us because we think it's good for the country, but we're going to do it anyway because it's good for us. And you systematically bring the tension down through a variety of different strategies. But it's been argued and done before. It was an influential conversation during the Cold War. It should be an influential conversation today.
Yeah, Irene.
I love the strategy, Peter, but the question is that in de-escalating, who are the people benefit? Who will be left out in that de-escalation? Even the folks that are on your side. I'm always concerned about that. And I think the reason why is that during the civil rights movement, King wrote "Why We Can't Wait." And so I think that we see this fierce urgency of right now from many marginalized groups, as well as groups on the right, because they feel for some reason victimized and not heard. So my point is like, I see the kind of theory about it, but how in application way, how might we do that? And we're feeling we're carrying everybody on this boat.
I'll respond.
It's fascinating. Go ahead, Peter.
Really, so I recently tweeted out the King's letter from Birmingham jail because he talks about this so beautifully, and he talks about creative tension and constructive tension. And what we believe needs to happen is what we call optimal tension. When tension gets so high that people become psychotic, you start to see what we saw on January 6th. We see these delusional things happening. That's not good for anybody. Ultimately, we need to keep the pressure on and the tension on, particularly for racial injustice, interethnic injustice, which is pervasive, and the exclusion of groups. The pressure has to stay, but the pressure, Gandhi and King were about nonviolence. They were about taking to the streets and mobilizing. And I'm all for that. I'm out there marching. I'm with you 100%. But when the escalation gets to the place where it's toxic and psychotic, we're in dangerous territory. So we have to find that space in America where people are mobilized, they're committed to reform, they see that the masses are joining in service of those that are marginalized, but we don't get to a place where we vilify all of them and lead to civil war. That's why 76% of the population think that we're, nearing civil war.
Can I just say one thing, Peter, to you though? So here we have January 6th. Okay, so it depends on how you look at it. I kind of saw it sort of what King says, the moral arc the universe of the universe is long, but it's bent towards justice. Because early that morning we saw two historic things happen. We saw, Raphael Warnock, and then with John Ossoff. I mean, and you're talking about in the Bible Belt, both of them, and that's where I see that kind of intersectional activism. And I was thinking, oh my God, King would be happy. And then we see later on that afternoon, that moment. But to me, that it depends on how you grow up, because to me, like, that's like, oh, if you grow up in the South, you kind of understand that. Like, again, when you see brown and black and marginalized ascendancy, you will always have a whitelash. We used to see it in form of the Klan, but I thought we got a sense of that even in Charlottesville. Like, it's sort of like when we look at Charlottesville, we were expecting the not JFK, sorry, forgive me for that, Robert F. Kennedy statue to be taken down. We saw the night before, a white supremacist group come out. So I mean, I kind of expect that it'll be this kind of movement for it'll move like this as opposed to a straight line. So I saw January 6th, not so much hopeful, but that justice will prevail.
So we've talked about this dynamic and this tension as it pertains to race a bit, as it pertains to democracy a bit, right? There's another crisis that we're dealing with right now is COVID, where we are seeing quite a bit of polarization there too, right? And we did just get a question from someone in the audience asking, how can we apply this conversation to vaccine hesitancy, where there is a heck of a lot of polarization in the way people are talking about it. Let me throw that out there. What lessons can we learn from some of the more successful cases or pitfalls that we've seen at some of the less successful ones? I know a number of you have written about this. Yeah.
I think one thing is you got to keep it local. You can't just lecture people, and you really got to listen to what their perspective is, right? I had a friend of mine who was in a health official. She's passed away in the UK. And she said, she was dealing with vaccine hesitancy and autism there. And she said, you really got to listen to people. I mean, maybe the person who's vaccine hesitant is a mom whose kid has autism, and she's trying to figure out, she feels a great deal of guilt about that. And she's trying to figure it out and understand it and understand at that level. Or maybe the people who are vaccine hesitant are people in color communities who, pharma and the medical industry is not treated very well in decades past. And maybe they have a fair amount of institutional skepticism. And so take those things seriously and try to have a real conversation rather than saying, hey, the science is clear. Why don't you listen to me? And take this shot.
I so agree with you about that, because I come from a community that is very hesitant at the beginning, given the Tuskegee study that is very well known today here. And I had hesitancy, and I'm responsible for a group of people. But my spouse, who's an ER physician, I told people very simply, I said, she's my canary in a coal mine. If she doesn't wake up dead, I assure you, I will get in line. Now, it sounds funny, but the point is that you have people in communities that you respect. And if they go forth, then by example, they will. And I also think that the rollout has to be also, particularly in urban and maybe rural areas. I grew up where didn't have a library or access. And so we had this mobile van that came, and everybody came out this day to get the book and stuff. I think we have to make it even more accessible, even though we say it is accessible.
So we're down to maybe the last 10 minutes or so. A member of the audience asks, how do the parties begin to talk with each other if one side, Republicans in large numbers, won't even accept the legitimacy of President Biden? I'd like to extrapolate that question a little bit, right? Replace Republicans and President Biden with, to the last conversation, people who don't buy the science on COVID vaccines or masks, which was incredibly polarizing, right? Extrapolate it to race, when one side won't even accept the notion that there is some level of systemic racism out there, right? When you have some truths and our dialogue, when there's hesitancy against fact, when there's hesitancy against expertise, when there's hesitancy against academia or any of the institutions that we used to go to just to get the baseline of facts that we could then launch the debate from, how do we begin to talk to one another? Deb, you want to take this one?
One comment is I think that when I think about a lot of conversations I've had with colleagues around this, of course, facts matter, and we're very worried about when false information, conspiracy theories take over. But I think there may be too much of an emphasis on facts and not enough on sharing of personal experiences. And I'll go back one more time to this point of listening, and I heard it in Archon's comments about vaccine hesitancy, that listening to the reasons for hesitancy sometimes, as I've found over the last few months in some of the work we're doing around understanding vaccine hesitancy, there's a very different experience people in some of these communities have had. The sources of distrust make total sense. Of course you're hesitant. And taking the time to hear someone else's lived experience can legitimize a point of view that you may not come to agree with. And that's very different than the facts. And there are a lot of facts, there's a lot of truths out there. Which truths should we attend to? And what happens if in a divided country, half of us are paying attention to one set of truths and the other half to another? You have blue facts and you have red facts, and if there's not very much in common between those, just the sort of battle over facts and reliable information may be misplaced if we don't put enough effort. And this is where I'll go back to some of the challenges I see with relying on the sort of social media as our primary way of understanding others, that this is not a place you tend to go and share your lived experiences. It's not a place to listen and learn and speak and be heard in that way. So I think creating those spaces is such an important element of how we get out of this mess.
But it's hard when every input in my life, right, is isolating me from people who have had diametrically opposite lived experiences from me, right? Because I live in a community surrounded by people who are like me. I go to work surrounded by people who are like me. My social media feed is populated by people who are like me. I get my news from places that reinforce what I already think. Like, how do we break through and help people see each other's lived experience? Peter?
Well, I think that we have to change that. We have to address that directly. But let me just say quickly that when you have a public health crisis like we have to remember how this started and how it was weaponized from the beginning, right? So COVID was not a public health crisis that could have united us as a nation, mobilized us together to fight an illness. Then you have a much smaller percentage of the population that are anxious for their own purpose experiences of the medical, distrust of the medical field, negative experiences they've had with vaccines. That's normal and typical. But COVID was weaponized. And so the residual, that's why, we can't move towards herd immunity. We can't get to a place where there are enough people vaccinated that it doesn't matter. And so you can't separate the political polarization and the politics of COVID and the rollout or the lack of rollout from the problem that we're dealing with right now. Regarding your other, Amanda's written a tremendous piece for journalists called Complicating the Narratives. My book, The Way Out, has a big section on complicating your life. And this is one of the main findings from our research, is that when things become simplistic, overly simplified, very complicated issues like, healthcare and immigration that are immensely complicated, when they become build the wall or don't build the wall, we're lost. We have to reintroduce nuance and complexity into our world, which means, find three people on the other side who think very differently from you, but you think are smart, and follow them on Twitter, on the NewsHour, on wherever you want to. Doesn't mean you need to listen to the insane fringe, right? Because that's just crazy making. But find people that differ from you and listen to them. We have to actively do this because we're physically separating and virtually separating. So we're in these tribes now. We have to decide to change that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And Mo, I think your story, you're a great model, right? Going on to Fox News. I think a key part of our civic responsibility in this time of polarization is to put ourselves in uncomfortable spaces, because we are hardwired for confirmation bias and to enter the tribe that makes us feel comfortable and to disregard information that doesn't confirm what we believed before. Right. So we have to, I think there's a responsibility to put ourselves in conversation with people that disagree. And, you know, a great example of this, people should Google PBS and Divided We Fall. It's a 1 hour show about, a couple of friends of mine made it, about 12 Republicans and 12 Democrats who are kind of ordinary Democrats and Republicans, and they hotbox them for a weekend and they make them kind of talk to each other. And by the end of it, Irene, one of the Republicans says, hey, you know, I really didn't get the race thing before, but I really think something like reparations, we need to explore that seriously, right? And the opening questions are like, okay, what's a moment that made you feel really proud to be an American? Everybody's the same. Oh, it was the Boston Marathon, or it was 9/11 when we all came together. And then they asked, well, what's a moment recently when you felt most sad to be an American? And like 2/3 of the Democrats, it was the Trump election, right? And you can kind of see that, right? But then for 2/3 of the Republicans, it was Colin Kaepernick and the football kneeling, right? And it's like, what? I just didn't get that. But that's the beginning of trying to understand what somebody else's worldview is. And that's where the conversation begins. And I think really it's that being willing to put yourself in an uncomfortable space and trying to really learn. Even, I don't expect to agree at the end of the day. That's not the point.
But that's a privileged position, though. I need to say that to put yourself in an uncomfortable is privilege. So because you do that, understanding nothing is lost to your personhood. Now, clearly, I wouldn't put myself in a Ku Klux Klan meeting and say, let's talk across our differences, brothers and sisters. However, the problem is this here. I can walk the streets of Cambridge, okay, and be stopped for walking while Black, or like Professor Henry Louis Gates a couple of blocks away for just trying to get in. So I think that when we see, and I so agree with Peter, we can't have pat answers. It has to be more nuanced, but it also has to be contextualized, also given the person who is doing this kind of what we call cross-pollination here. Now, I will send Peter to go talk to the Klan, okay? And the rest of y'all to talk to some of my neighbors so that they know that Thea and I are not the cleanup lady. We should clean our house, but we're not the cleanup ladies.
Amanda, do you want to weigh in on this?
This is great. I mean, I think there's a lot here. These are really hard problems. I feel like I got some good ideas. I hope it sparked some conversations and some thoughts for people. I'm sure it made some people mad in the chat, whatever. Luckily for us, we can't see the chat, so sorry. But I'd love to see it later with a glass of wine. But yeah, I mean, I think, one thing I will say, I went into this, like I started writing about polarization like 5 years ago, and I was super skeptical of this whole like talking across divides, and like I just felt like, oh, come on now. That's going to work for some people, but not, you can't scale it, come on. And I think it does have to be done right, and it does have to be done thoughtfully. And there's a ton of research on this. Like there've been 500 studies all over the world on contact theory. Like there's certain conditions you have to meet to do this right. Don't do it at home without reading that research, okay? But I will say this, I have now seen good conflict in front of my face in different kinds across racial, political, and it's not always these dialogue groups that have, all different kinds. Like there are institutions and families and neighborhoods who are doing this work, churches, synagogues. And I have seen it in front of my face, what this good conflict looks like so many times that I have to tell you, you are missing out if you don't experience this. There is almost like an addictive quality to that. Like once you experience that sense of curiosity in profound difference and division, it is like transcendent and you want more. And that's true all over the world. Search for Common Ground that does this work all over the world in like serious conflict zones. They said the same thing. Like once you get it, you get a taste of what that feels like to be curious and to be surprised and to be open and to hold to the thing you hold dear. It's just the coolest thing. It's like there's a joy to it. And I'm not lying. I know it sounds Pollyanna, but it is for real. So I would encourage all of us to be as creative as we can be in finding the spaces and places to do that really well. We need to fight better as a country. We are stuck with each other. You know what I mean? So we need to get smarter.
I just want to add one point here, which is I think, what we're doing in this conversation is so important. And, and Amanda in her book makes it so clear to understand, this difference between good and bad conflict. I kind of equate the bad conflict with Peter's toxicity, that recognizing that's the enemy and making it clear to all of us. And I found this can be so powerful with our kids. I've got 2 young teens, explaining to them what YouTube was doing to them and that they were being duped into being pulled into that toxicity. It made them mad and they understood. And that little bit of, kind of learning and stepping back and saying, here's the systems. And by the way, this toxicity is bad for most of us. And there's a few people, these conflict entrepreneurs, as Amanda calls them, and the rest of us are getting duped. And we're wallowing in this toxicity, but there's stuff we can do about it. I think, having these conversations and giving people tools, I'm an optimist. There are ways to do something about it.
Can I give one quick?
So we're going to have to give Deb one quick one. We're past time. Go ahead, Peter. Yeah.
Which connects to solutions and connects to Amanda's point of finding these groups. If you go to the Bridging Divides initiative at Princeton, there's a map of the United States. And on that map, what they've found are the 7,000 and counting community-based groups that are operating all over this country. That are usually based on contact theory. And again, they do it in different ways. But if you're looking for a place to go where they're doing this systematically and thoughtfully, go to that website and you'll find things in your neighborhood that you didn't know existed.
I could keep going for hours. I am loving this conversation. So we're just going to have to do it again at some point. Archon, Deb, Irene, Amanda, Peter, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your insights with all of us. I know I learned so much. I want to thank the JFK Library for hosting this conversation. You all do such amazing work. You do such great programming. As someone that does a lot of programming myself with my day job, it ain't easy to keep having conversations like this, particularly in this virtual environment that we've been in. And you guys are hitting home runs every day. So thank you for hosting us and choosing this topic in this panel. And most importantly, thank you to the audience for giving up part of your evening to engage with us in this conversation. I cannot wait to look at this lively chat later on tonight. Amanda, I'll pour a glass of wine as well, and we'll enjoy it. Thank you all so much, and have a great night.
Good night. Thank you.